She could hear every wolf's thoughts, until the Alpha King became the one mind she could never reach. In the small mountain village of Blackthorn, there lived a young woman named Elara, who was different from everyone else. Ever since she was a little girl, she could hear the thoughts of wolves. Not just the wolves that ran wild in the forest, but the wolves who lived among people too, the ones who could change their shape and walk on two legs when the moon called them home. To Elara, their minds were never silent. She could sit quietly at the edge of a room and know exactly what someone was thinking, even if their face showed nothing at all. Her gift had come without warning. She remembered the day it started clearly, even though she had been only 6 years old. She had been playing near the old well behind her house when she suddenly heard a voice that was not spoken out loud. It was her neighbor's dog, a big gray wolfhound named Bruno, and his thoughts were as simple and warm as sunshine. He was thinking about a bone he had buried the day before, and wondering if it was still there. Elara had laughed out loud, thinking it was the funniest thing she had ever heard. She ran inside to tell her mother, who went pale and quiet, and that was the first time Elara understood that what she could do was not something every child could do. As she grew older, she learned to hear not just simple animal thoughts, but human thoughts too, especially those of the shifters who lived in her village. Blackthorn was a pack town, one of many scattered across the mountains where wolf shifters lived alongside ordinary people, though most outsiders never knew the difference. The pack elders soon realized what a treasure they had in young Elara. She could tell when someone was lying before they even finished speaking. She could sense fear hiding behind a smile, or anger tucked quietly beneath calm words. In a world where trust was often a matter of life and death, her gift made her one of the most valuable people in the whole village. By the time she turned 22, Elara had become something like an unofficial guardian of the peace. When two families argued over land, she was called to listen. When a stranger came asking for shelter, she was the one who checked whether his story was true. She never boasted about her gift, and in fact, most of the time, she wished she could turn it off. Hearing everyone's thoughts all the time was tiring. She often wore an amulet given to her by the pack healer, a smooth stone on a leather cord, which helped her block out unwanted noise when she needed peace and quiet. Even with the amulet, though, if someone was standing close enough and feeling something strongly, she still caught pieces of it, like static crackling through a fence. Just a few days before the news of the king's visit reached Blackthorn, Elara had been called to settle a small dispute between two farming families who shared a fence line at the edge of the village. One family accused the other of moving the fence posts in the night to steal a strip of good grazing land. Voices had been raised, old friendships strained, and old Garrick had asked Elara to sit quietly nearby while both families spoke their case. Within minutes, she had known the truth. The younger son of one family had moved the posts on his own, without his parents' knowledge, hoping to win favor by giving his family more land. He had not meant real harm, only foolish pride, and once Elara gently pointed the elders toward the truth, the matter was settled with an apology and a shared meal instead of a lasting grudge. It was small work compared to what she would soon be asked to do, but it reminded her why her gift mattered. Even when it tired her, even when she longed for silence, it kept her village steady and fair. Elara had never met anyone whose mind she could not enter, not once in all her 22 years. Every person she had ever tried to listen to, she had heard, even if only faintly, whether they were kind or cruel, honest or full of secrets. That was why the day the Alpha King arrived changed everything for her. The news came a week before his visit. Messengers from the northern packs rode into Blackthorn with word that King Ronan Ashgrave, ruler of all the northern wolf territories, was traveling south to meet with the leaders of the smaller packs. There had been tension building for years between the north and the south, old grudges over hunting grounds and old wounds from a war that had ended before Elara was even born. Now, for the first time in a generation, the packs were trying to make peace, and Blackthorn had been chosen as the meeting place because it sat right on the border between the two territories. The village buzzed with nervous excitement. Some people were thrilled at the idea of finally ending years of conflict. Others were afraid, remembering stories their grandparents had told about the northern wolves and their fierce, unforgiving king. Elara had heard plenty of rumors about Ronan Ashgrave over the years. They said he had taken the throne as a very young man, after his parents were killed in a betrayal so shocking it was still spoken of in hushed voices. They said he ruled with an iron will, that his soldiers feared him more than they feared their enemies, and that he had never once shown mercy to a traitor. They said his eyes were cold as winter, and that no one, not even his closest advisors, truly knew what he was thinking. Elara had rolled her eyes at some of these stories, certain they were exaggerated the way most rumors about powerful men always were. Still, when the pack elders called her in the day before his arrival, she felt a small flutter of nerves. "You know why we need you," said old Garrick, the village elder, folding his weathered hands on the table in front of him. "This peace is fragile. One wrong word, one hidden lie from either side, and it could fall apart before it even begins. We need to know that King Ronan means what he says. We need someone who can listen." "I understand," Elara said. "I'll be there." She did not tell him that she was curious too. In all her years of listening to minds, she had never had the chance to listen to a king. The day Ronan Ashgrave arrived in Blackthorn, the whole village turned out to watch. He came with a modest group of guards, fewer than anyone expected for a king, riding tall black horses through the dirt road that led into the village square. Elara stood near the front of the crowd, arms crossed, trying to look calm even though her heart was beating a little faster than usual. When she finally saw him, she understood at once why people spoke of him the way they did. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp features, dressed simply for a king, in a plain gray coat with no crown or jewels to mark his rank. He did not need any of that. Something about the way he carried himself, straight-backed and unhurried, told everyone watching exactly who was in charge. His eyes swept over the crowd, calm and steady, missing nothing. Elara did what she always did when someone new arrived. She reached out with her gift, letting her mind brush lightly against his, expecting to hear something, anything, the way she always did. She heard nothing. At first, she thought she had done something wrong. She tried again, focusing harder, the way she had learned to do when a mind was particularly quiet or guarded. Still nothing. It was not like listening to someone whose thoughts were simply calm or careful. It was like standing in front of a stone wall. There was no crack, no gap, no whisper slipping through. For the first time in her entire life, Elara could not hear a single thing. She must have been staring, because when Ronan's gaze swept past the crowd, it stopped on her. For just a second, their eyes met, and Elara felt her face go warm with embarrassment, as if he somehow knew exactly what she had been trying to do. He did not smile, but something flickered in his expression, something like curiosity, before he looked away and continued walking toward the village hall, where the elders waited to greet him. That evening, the peace talks began in the village hall, a large wooden building normally used for festivals and gatherings. Long tables had been set up, with representatives from both the northern and southern packs sitting across from each other. Elara sat off to the side, as she always did during important meetings, close enough to listen, far enough not to draw attention. The talks went slowly. There was a lot of old anger in that room, old wounds that had never healed properly. One southern elder stood and spoke bitterly about a hunting ground his grandfather had lost to the north 2 wars ago, his voice shaking with a grief that felt fresh even after so many years. A northern captain answered just as sharply, listing the villages his own family had lost when the border shifted the other way. For a moment, it seemed as though old anger might swallow the whole meeting before it had even properly begun. Elara listened carefully to each speaker, checking their words against their thoughts, nodding subtly to old Garrick whenever someone spoke honestly, and giving him a small warning look whenever she caught a flicker of deception. It was tiring work, but she was good at it, and the talks moved forward bit by bit. When the southern elder finished his angry speech, she caught, underneath his sharp words, a genuine ache for the peace he claimed not to want, and she quietly told Garrick so. He used that small truth to soften the man's position before the evening was through, and slowly, painfully, the room began to calm. Through it all, she kept glancing at Ronan, unable to help herself. He spoke rarely, choosing his words carefully, and when he did speak, the whole room seemed to quiet down and listen. Elara tried, again and again, to catch even a small piece of his thoughts, some hint of what he was really feeling behind that calm, unreadable face. Every single time she found only silence. It was strange, she realized, how unsettling silence could be when you had spent your whole life surrounded by noise. She had always thought that hearing everyone's thoughts was exhausting, that a little quiet would be a relief. But this kind of quiet was different. It felt less like peace, and more like being locked out of a room she desperately wanted to enter. At the end of the first day of talks, as the hall was emptying out, Ronan approached her directly. Elara straightened up, startled, as he walked over with the same calm, measured steps she had noticed earlier. "You were watching me," he said. It was not a question. Elara considered lying, then decided against it, mostly because she suspected he would know anyway. "I was trying to listen," she admitted. "I can hear people's thoughts. It's why the elders wanted me here, to make sure everyone at these talks is being honest." "I know what you are," Ronan said. "Your reputation reached the north long before I did, a mind listener in Blackthorn, one who has never failed to catch a lie." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "And yet you could not hear me." "No," Elara said, deciding there was no point pretending otherwise. "I couldn't hear anything at all, not a single thought." Something like amusement crossed his face, quick and quiet. "That has never happened to you before." "Never," Elara said. "Good," Ronan said simply, and for a moment, Elara thought that was the end of the conversation, but then he added, "It should stay that way. My mind is my own, and I intend to keep it that way, no matter how skilled you are." There was no cruelty in his voice when he said it, only a plain, quiet certainty, the kind of thing a person says when they have decided something a very long time ago and never once doubted it since. Elara felt a strange mix of frustration and fascination. Frustration, because for the first time, her gift was completely useless. Fascination, because she wanted, more than she had ever wanted anything, to know why. "May I ask why?" she said. "Most people, even the ones with something to hide, don't build walls that strong. It takes years of training to block a mind listener completely, and even then, most people slip eventually. Yours never has, not even for a second." Ronan was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Elara thought he would not answer at all. "Some things are safer kept behind walls," he said finally. "Trust me when I say, I have good reason." He left after that, walking out of the hall with the same unhurried steps, leaving Elara standing there with more questions than she had started with. The following weeks were unlike anything Elara had ever experienced. The peace talks stretched on, moving slowly through disputes about hunting grounds, old debts, and border lines that had shifted many times over the years. Elara continued to sit in on the meetings, and slowly, she and Ronan began spending more time together outside of the formal talks as well. At first it was simple things, walking together through the village after long meetings, discussing the day's arguments, and trying to figure out how to smooth over disagreements between the two sides. Ronan, it turned out, was thoughtful and sharp-minded, someone who listened carefully before he spoke and who cared more about doing what was right for his people than about being seen as powerful. Elara found herself looking forward to these walks more than she wanted to admit. There was something freeing about talking to someone whose thoughts she could not hear. With everyone else, she was always half listening to two conversations at once, the words someone said out loud and the truer, quieter thoughts running underneath. With Ronan, she had only his words, and she found that she had to actually pay attention to him the way ordinary people paid attention to each other, watching his face, listening to the tone of his voice, noticing the small things he did not say out loud but showed instead. It was harder, in some ways. It was also, she began to realize, far more honest. One afternoon, when the talks broke early for the day, Ronan asked if she might show him around the village properly, since he had seen little of Blackthorn, beyond the meeting hall and the guest house where his men were staying. Elara agreed, and for a few hours, she led him past the orchard where the village children played, past the mill by the river, and up the narrow trail that climbed the hill overlooking the whole valley. Ronan asked question after question, about the crops, about the families, about how a village so small managed to stay so close-knit. He seemed genuinely curious, not merely being polite, and Elara found herself surprised by how easily he laughed when one of the village dogs bounded up to greet them, tail wagging, completely unbothered by the fact that he was greeting a king. "They don't care who you are," Elara said, smiling as the dog nosed at Ronan's hand. "Dogs never do. It's rather refreshing, isn't it?" "It is," Ronan admitted, crouching down to scratch behind the dog's ears, looking, for just a moment, less like a king carrying the weight of 2 territories and more like an ordinary young man enjoying a quiet afternoon. "In the north, everyone bows the moment they see me. Sometimes I forget what it feels like to simply be looked at, rather than looked up to." "Well," Elara said, "up here, you're just a man showing entirely too much interest in a dog named Pepper. I think that suits you." He looked up at her then, something soft in his expression that she was beginning to recognize, though she still could not name it fully. "I think I agree," he said quietly. One evening, weeks into the talks, they sat together on the low stone wall that overlooked the village, watching the sun go down over the mountains. The negotiations had hit a difficult point that day, an old argument about a stretch of forest both packs claimed as their own, and Elara could tell Ronan was troubled by it, even without being able to hear his thoughts. "You're worried," she said. He glanced at her, surprised. "How do you know that?" "You said you can't hear me." "I can't," Elara said, "but I don't need to hear your thoughts to see that you're worried. Your jaw is tight. You keep looking toward the northern road instead of the southern one, like you're thinking about the people back home who are counting on you to bring back peace, not more trouble." Ronan studied her for a moment, something warm flickering behind his eyes. "You're better at reading people than you give yourself credit for. Maybe you don't need your gift as much as you think." "Maybe," Elara said, "though it would still be nice to know what's going on in that head of yours, just once." "Would it?" Ronan asked, his voice quieter now, "or would you find it disappointing? Everyone assumes a king's mind must be full of grand schemes and important secrets. Mostly it's just tired thoughts about how much I want this piece to work and how much I'm afraid of failing at it." Elara looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw past the calm, controlled exterior the entire village had been so afraid of. She saw someone who carried a heavy weight and had been carrying it alone for a long time. "I don't think that sounds disappointing at all," she said softly. "I think it sounds human." Ronan did not answer right away, but something eased in his shoulders, and for a moment they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the last colors of sunset fade behind the mountains. As the days passed, Elara found herself telling Ronan things she had never told anyone else, about how tiring her gift could be, how sometimes she wished she could just be an ordinary person for a single day, free from the constant noise of other people's minds. Ronan listened without judgment, understanding in a way few others could, since he too had spent his whole life being seen, not as a person but as a title, a symbol, a king rather than a man. One night, sitting by the fire in the small guest house where Ronan was staying, Elara admitted something she had never said out loud to anyone before, not even to old Garrick, who had known her since she was a child. "Sometimes," she said quietly, staring into the flames, "I hear things I wish I hadn't. Someone's grief over a person they lost, someone's shame over a mistake they never told anyone about. I can't turn it off completely, not even with the amulet. It just quiets things a little. I carry pieces of everyone around me, all the time, whether I want to or not." Ronan was quiet for a moment, watching her rather than the fire. "That sounds like a heavy thing to carry alone," he said. "It is," Elara admitted, "but it's also who I am. I can't imagine being any other way, even on the hard days." "I don't think you should have to imagine it," Ronan said gently. "I think the world is better for having someone willing to carry all of that, even when it costs her something. That doesn't mean you have to carry it silently, though. Not around me, at least. You can tell me when it's heavy." Elara looked over at him, surprised by how much those simple words meant to her. No one had ever offered to help carry that weight before. Not really. Most people simply expected her to manage it, grateful for what her gift gave them, without ever wondering what it took from her in return. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't think anyone has ever said that to me before." "Then I am glad I could be the first," Ronan said, and the warmth in his voice settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. One night, walking back from a long and difficult round of talks, Ronan finally began to explain why his mind was locked so tightly, something Elara had wondered about since the very first day. "When I was young," he said, "before I became king, my family was betrayed by someone we trusted completely. A mind listener, much like you, someone who had served my family for years and had our full confidence. That listener was working for our enemies the entire time, feeding them everything about our defenses, our plans, our weaknesses. My parents did not survive that betrayal." Elara's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry. I was young when it happened, but old enough to understand," Ronan continued. "After that day, I swore I would never let anyone into my mind again. Not fully, not completely, no matter how much I trusted them. I trained for years to build the walls you cannot get through. It was the only way I knew to protect myself, and eventually, to protect my people." "That makes sense," Elara said quietly. "I understand why you would want to protect yourself that way." "I know it seems cold," Ronan said, "being unreadable, unreachable. Sometimes I wonder if it has cost me more than it has protected me. It is a lonely way to live, never letting anyone truly know you." Elara reached out without thinking and rested her hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to explain it to me like you're asking permission. I understand walls. I understand needing to protect the parts of yourself that got hurt before." Ronan looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The air between them felt different somehow, charged with something neither of them had said out loud yet. "Elara," he said finally, "I have not wanted anyone close to me in a very long time. Not really, not fully. And now," she asked softly, "now I am not so sure anymore," he admitted. They stood there a moment longer before Ronan gently stepped back, as if catching himself before he said too much. "The talks continue tomorrow," he said. "We should both rest." Elara nodded, though her heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cold night air. As the weeks went on, the peace talks slowly began to succeed. Old grudges were laid to rest one by one, agreements were reached about shared hunting grounds, and both sides began to trust that this peace might actually last. To celebrate the progress, the elders of Blackthorn organized a grand feast, inviting representatives from both the northern and southern packs to share a meal together for the first time in decades. In the days leading up to the feast, one of Ronan's oldest advisors, a steady, gray-haired man named Feldar, who had served the Ashgrave family since before Ronan was born, pulled him aside after a long day of talks. "You are spending a great deal of time with the mind listener," Feldar said carefully, choosing his words the way a man does when he is unsure how they will be received. "I am," Ronan said simply, offering no further explanation. "I only mention it," Feldar continued, "because I have not seen you speak so freely with anyone since you were a boy, before everything happened with your parents. I am glad of it, truly. I only wonder if you have considered what it means, letting someone close after so many years of keeping everyone at a distance." Ronan was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the village from the window of the guest house. "I have considered it more than you know," he admitted finally. "I built those walls to protect myself, Feldar, not to punish myself. I think perhaps I forgot the difference somewhere along the way. She has reminded me of it." Feldar studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, something like relief in his weathered face. "Then I am glad, my king. Truly, your father would have wanted to see you happy, not merely safe." The words stayed with Ronan long after Feldar had gone, and it was with that quiet conversation still turning over in his mind that he arrived at the feast a few nights later, watching for Elara the moment he stepped through the door. The night of the feast, the village hall was transformed, filled with candlelight and long tables loaded with food. Elara wore a simple green dress, and when Ronan saw her arrive, something in his expression softened in a way she had rarely seen from him in public. They spent much of the evening near each other, talking and laughing more freely than either of them usually allowed themselves. But not everyone in the room wished the peace to succeed. Unknown to Elara, unknown even to the careful elders who had trusted her to catch every lie, a small group among the southern delegates had been secretly working against the peace from the very beginning. They belonged to a faction that had profited from the years of conflict between North and South, trading weapons and information during the long years of tension. A lasting peace would mean the end of their profits and their power. They had sent one of their own into the feast that night with a single, desperate goal: to make sure the talks collapsed for good, even if it meant harming the Alpha King himself. Elara had checked every delegate's thoughts carefully throughout the weeks of negotiation, but this particular man had joined the Southern Party only days before the feast, posing as a minor merchant's assistant, someone so unimportant that no one thought to bring him before Elara for questioning. It was a small gap, a single missed thread in an otherwise careful web, but it was enough. The feast was in full swing, musicians playing softly in the corner, laughter filling the hall, when Elara felt a sudden, sharp wrongness prickle at the edge of her senses. She had spent so many years listening to minds that she had developed an instinct for danger even before she consciously understood what she was sensing. She turned, scanning the crowd, and caught sight of a figure moving quickly and purposefully toward where Ronan stood talking with one of the northern elders. She did not have time to reach out with her gift and check his thoughts properly. There was only time to act. She saw the glint of a blade hidden in the man's sleeve, saw him raising his arm, and without thinking, without hesitating even for a heartbeat, Elara threw herself forward, placing herself between the blade and Ronan. The blade caught her along the arm instead of striking Ronan as intended, a sharp, burning line of pain that made her gasp, but it was nowhere near as deep or dangerous as it could have been. Guards who had been stationed quietly around the hall reacted instantly, tackling the attacker to the ground before he could strike again. The hall erupted into shouting and chaos, but Elara barely noticed any of it, her vision narrowing to the throbbing pain in her arm and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Elara!" Ronan's voice cut through the noise, sharp with fear in a way she had never heard from him before. His arms caught her as her knees buckled, easing her down gently rather than letting her fall. And then, for just one moment, in the midst of his panic and fear, the wall around Ronan's mind cracked. It was not a full opening, not the complete access Elara had once hoped to have, but it was enough. For one brief, overwhelming instant, she heard him, heard the raw terror flooding through his thoughts at the sight of her hurt, heard beneath that terror something even deeper, something he had never said aloud to her, or to anyone. She heard him think, clear as a bell despite the chaos around them, that he could not bear the thought of losing her, that somewhere over these past weeks, without meaning to, he had let her further into his heart than he had ever let anyone in his entire life. The wall closed again almost as quickly as it had cracked, but Elara had heard enough. She managed a small, pained smile up at him, even as the village healer rushed over to tend to her wound. The village healer, a calm older woman named Petra, who had tended half the injuries in Blackthorn over the years, cleaned and wrapped the cut carefully, while Ronan hovered nearby, unable to keep the worry from his face, no matter how he tried to steady himself. "It's a shallow cut," Petra said reassuringly, glancing between the two of them. "It will sting for a few days, and she'll want to keep it clean, but there's no lasting harm done. She was lucky. Whoever swung that blade was aiming higher." "He was aiming for me," Ronan said quietly, his jaw tight. "Then it's a good thing someone loved you enough to get in the way," Petra said simply, tying off the bandage with practiced hands. She gave Elara a knowing look before gathering her supplies and stepping out to check on the rest of the hall, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet side room. Elara flexed her fingers experimentally, testing the bandage, and managed a small, crooked smile despite the ache in her arm. "She's not wrong, you know," she said, "about the loving part." Ronan let out a breath that was half laugh, half something closer to disbelief, and sat down heavily in the chair beside her, running a hand over his face. "You frightened me more than that blade ever could have," he admitted. I have faced enemies on open battlefields, Elara. I have never in my life felt fear the way I felt it watching you fall. I'm all right, she said gently, reaching for his hand with her uninjured arm. Truly, Ronan, I'm all right. You heard something, Ronan said quietly, once the healer had confirmed her injury was not serious. Just a shallow cut that would heal within days. They sat together in a quiet side room while the chaos of the feast settled outside. I felt it. Just for a moment, I lost control. I heard enough, Elara admitted softly. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her bandaged arm with an expression of such quiet guilt that Elara reached out and took his hand. It's not your fault, she said. I chose to step in front of that blade. I would choose it again. Why? Ronan asked, his voice rough. Why would you risk your life for mine? Elara considered the question carefully before she answered, wanting to give him the truth rather than an easy answer. Because somewhere along these past weeks, I stopped seeing you as just the Alpha King I was sent to watch over, she said. I started seeing you as someone I cared about. Someone I wanted to protect, the same way you and your guards have been protecting this peace and this village. I didn't think about it. I just knew I couldn't let anything happen to you. Ronan looked at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, he did something Elara had never expected him to do. He closed his eyes, and she felt the walls around his mind begin to lower, not by accident this time, not cracked open by fear or panic, but opened on purpose, freely, as a gift given rather than something taken. For the first time, Elara heard him completely. She heard the years of loneliness he had carried since his parents' death, the crushing weight of responsibility he had shouldered from such a young age, the careful walls he had built brick by brick to protect himself from ever being betrayed again. She heard his doubts about whether he was truly capable of leading his people well, doubts he had never once shown on his calm, composed face. And beneath all of it, steady and warm and utterly certain, she heard exactly what she had glimpsed in that brief moment of panic during the attack. She heard how much he had come to care for her, not despite her gift, but because of the honest, unguarded way she had treated him from the very beginning, the first person in years who had made him feel like a man rather than merely a king. Tears filled Elara's eyes, though she was smiling. You didn't have to do that, she whispered, not after everything you told me about why you built those walls in the first place. I know, Ronan said, opening his eyes to look at her, his own voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. But you are not the person my walls were built against. You never tried to take anything from me that I did not want to give. You only ever waited, patiently, for me to be ready. I think I have been ready for a while now. I was just too afraid to admit it. 100. In the days that followed, the man who had tried to harm Ronan was questioned thoroughly by the elders of both packs together, a rare sight in itself, north and south working side by side rather than across a table from each other. He confessed quickly once he realized how little loyalty his employers actually held for him, and named the small group of traders who had sent him, men who had grown rich for years smuggling weapons across the tense border, and who stood to lose everything once peace was declared. Runners were sent out that same night, and within 2 days, the ringleaders of the group had been found and brought before both packs to answer for what they had done. Elara sat in on those proceedings as well, her arm still wrapped in a clean bandage, and for once her gift was not needed to catch a lie, since the evidence against the traitors was clear enough on its own. Still, old Garrick asked her to listen all the same, out of habit more than necessity, and she confirmed what everyone already suspected, that the men showed no remorse for what they had done, only anger at having been caught. Northern and Southern leaders agreed together on their punishment, a decision made jointly for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, and something about that shared judgment seemed to matter more to both sides than the punishment itself. It was proof, plain and undeniable, that the two packs could stand together even in difficulty, not only in celebration. Rather than shattering the fragile trust between North and South, the attack ended up strengthening it, as both sides came together, angry and united against those who had tried to tear their hard-won peace apart. Word spread quickly through both territories of how a young woman from Blackthorn had thrown herself between an assassin's blade and the Alpha King, and how the northern and southern packs had worked side by side to catch the traitors responsible. By the time the treaty was ready to be signed, it was signed not out of cautious duty, but out of a real, hard-won trust that the attack had somehow, strangely, helped to build. The treaty was signed within the week, sealing an agreement that would end decades of conflict between the two territories. The morning of the signing dawned bright and clear, the kind of crisp mountain morning that made the whole valley seem to shine. Long tables were set up in the village square, decorated with ribbons in both the colors of the North and the South, and cooks from both territories worked side by side, preparing food for the celebration that would follow. Children ran between the tables, laughing, some of them wearing the colors of the North, others the South, with no thought at all for the old lines that had once divided their parents and grandparents so bitterly. Elara stood beside Ronan on the day the treaty was formally signed, her arm still lightly bandaged beneath her sleeve, watching as representatives from both packs placed their hands on the ancient parchment, one after another, each signature met with a quiet cheer from the gathered crowd. Old Garrick signed for Blackthorn with a proud, steady hand, and when Ronan stepped forward to add his own name as the final signature, the entire square fell silent, watching their king seal a peace that would shape the future of both territories for generations to come. When his name was finally written, the cheer that rose up from the crowd was loud enough to send birds scattering from the trees at the edge of the village. The village square was filled with people from both the North and the South, celebrating together for the first time in living memory. "What happens now?" Elara asked quietly, as the celebrations continued around them. "You'll go back to your territory. I'll stay here in Blackthorn." Ronan turned to her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw none of the careful control he usually wore like armor. His face was open, honest, and a little nervous, an expression she suspected very few people in his life had ever been allowed to see. "I was hoping," he said slowly, "that you might consider coming with me, not merely as a mind listener assigned to watch over another peace treaty, as someone who wishes to stay by my side because she wants to, the same way I want you there." Elara felt her heart swell with a warmth she had never quite experienced before. She had spent her entire life hearing the thoughts of everyone around her, always one step ahead, always aware of what people truly felt, even when their words said something different. With Ronan, she had learned something new. She had learned what it meant to wait patiently for someone to open up on their own, to earn trust rather than simply listen her way into it, and to be loved not despite her strange gift, but because of the honest, caring person she was underneath it. "I would like that," she said, smiling up at him. "Though I should warn you, I still can't read your mind whenever I want. You'll have to actually tell me what you're thinking, the old-fashioned way." Ronan laughed, a real, warm laugh that Elara had rarely heard from him before, and it was, she thought, one of the most beautiful sounds she had ever heard. "I think," he said, taking her hand in his, "that I would like that very much. After all these years of silence, I find I finally have someone I want to talk to." As the sun set over Blackthorn that evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Elara looked out over the celebrating crowd, at the northern and southern wolves finally standing together in peace, and then up at Ronan beside her, the one mind in the whole world she had never been able to hear, and the one heart that had chosen, freely and completely, to let her in. She had spent her whole life listening to others without ever having to ask. With Ronan, for the first time, she had learned the far greater gift of being told, openly and honestly, exactly how much she was loved. And as they stood together watching the sunset, Elara realized that some connections were built not on hearing every thought a person had, but on trust, patience, and the quiet choice to be truly known by someone else, one honest word at a time. In the months that followed, Elara said her goodbyes to Blackthorn, promising old Garrick and the village elders that she would visit often, and that the village would always have a friend in the northern court, should they ever need one. Her mother cried at the leaving, though they were happy tears more than sad ones, and Bruno, the old wolfhound, gray around the muzzle now, thumped his tail against the ground as if he understood, in his simple way, that his young friend was stepping into a new and larger chapter of her life. Elara moved north to be by Ronan's side, and though she never regained the ability to hear his thoughts the way she could with everyone else, she found she did not need to. They built something rarer between them than her gift had ever given her with anyone else, a bond made of honesty freely given rather than truth quietly overheard. In the northern castle, she found her place not simply as the king's companion, but as someone the northern pack came to trust in her own right, called upon just as she had been in Blackthorn, to listen, to advise, and to help settle disputes fairly. She missed her village, but she found a new kind of home in the north as well, one built around a man who had chosen, every single day, to keep his walls open for her. The peace between the northern and southern packs held strong for many years, remembered by both sides as the treaty that had nearly failed and instead became the strongest bond either territory had ever known. Traders moved freely across the old border now, and children from both sides grew up hearing the story of the mind listener who had thrown herself in front of a blade for a king she could not read, and the king who had, in turn, opened his mind to her freely rather than let fear keep them apart. It became, in time, one of the most beloved stories told in both territories, not because it was a tale of grand battles or powerful magic, but because it was, at its heart, a simple story about two people who chose honesty over walls and trust over fear. And in the great hall of the northern castle, visitors would often notice something unusual about their king. Unlike other rulers, who kept their thoughts carefully hidden behind practiced expressions, King Ronan Ashgrave was known for speaking plainly and honestly with the woman who sat beside him, sharing his worries and his hopes with her in quiet conversations late into the evening. Those who knew their story understood why. He had spent his whole life guarding his mind from anyone who might use it against him, until he met the one person for whom he chose, freely and without fear, to open it completely. Elara never became able to read Ronan's thoughts, not truly, not the way she could read everyone else's. But she came to understand that this had never been the point. She did not need to hear his mind to know his heart. He showed her that, every single day, in the way he looked at her, in the way he spoke to her honestly rather than hiding behind silence, and in the quiet, steady love that had grown between them from that very first day when she had reached for his mind and found, for the first time in her life, a wall she could not break through and a man worth waiting for on the other side of it.